Welcome to the Clemson Dubcast, a rainy Saturday here in upstate South Cac. Perfect day to publish a podcast. The lengthy Danny Ford series is complete, and we're going to talk a lot about that with Pete Yanity in our second interview. But right now, this weekend, Paul Strelo and I doing some deep dives on the current state of affairs with Clemson football, quarterback situation, wide receiver situation, defensive end, Xavier Thomas. Check it all out at TigerIllustrated.com. Title sponsor of the Dubcast since the very beginning, back in August of 2018, Parham Smith & Archenhold Law Firm in downtown Greenville. They want you to know that their office remains open and available to serve you during the COVID-19 crisis. They are also offering their clients the ability to meet via telephone or through video conferencing. Whether you have a loved one who has suffered from a car accident, defective product, a neglectful nursing home facility, or medical malpractice issue, Parham Smith & Archenhold's Greenville lawyers can provide the protection and guidance you need. Free consultations, 864-990-4581, or on the web at parhamlaw.com. That's Parham law.com. Want to share a quick word about Founders Federal Credit Union. If you've been to a sporting event in Clemson, you've probably heard about Founders already. They are the official credit union partner of the Clemson Tigers. In addition to that, all Clemson faculty, staff, and students are eligible for membership as well as IPTAY members. Matt Gross is a proud Clemson alum and the vice president for the Clemson market for Founders Federal Credit Union. Matt's office is located beside the Walmart Neighborhood Market on Old Greenville Highway in Clemson. For more information, go to foundersfcu.com. Another loyal supporter of the Dubcast is Blackacre Law Firm in Greenville, a subsidiary of Parham Smith & Archenhold. Blackacre helps South Carolina residents achieve their dreams of home ownership by providing experienced professional representation for real estate closings. Attention to detail is crucial in real estate law. Blackacre is committed to making sure nothing gets by them preparing residential or commercial closings. Blackacre also offers estate planning services for their clients in the Greenville area. Find out more about Blackacre at 864-326-3507. Okay, to our first interview with Cole Cubelic of ESPN, a frequent guest of the Dubcast. He was in Athens, Georgia last weekend for Georgia's spring game. I'm guessing that a lot of y'all might be interested in some of his observations given the fairly large exhibition coming up in the opener in Charlotte. So we'll start with Cole and then to Pete Yanity. Here we go. All right, joined by Cole Cubelic, who was in Athens, lovely Athens, Georgia, last weekend. How you doing, man?
Hey, doing great, Larry. How are you?
I'm doing well. Really interested to get some of your insights, not just on what you saw during the G-Day game, but, man, UTV guys have an enviable sort of position in the age of reduced access, you know, for the beat reporters who do it every day. You guys get to visit with the coaches beforehand and watching the broadcast of the game and reading some of your social media correspondence. It seemed like you got some really good insight in a lot of your conversations with not just the coaches, but also JT Daniels. What was your sort of overriding takeaway from your weekend in Athens?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff we got is, I don't want to say there are any real secrets or anything, but it's just maybe confirmation on some questions that people have had. You know, the JT stuff, I just don't think anybody really knows him. I don't think he hadn't come through media days. He hadn't sat down for a bunch of interviews. He hasn't really been introduced to SEC fans or college football fans. So I don't know if there's a misperception. I don't know if there was a perception. I think people see, oh, California kid, oh, Keaton Slovis gets the job and you leave and come across the country to Georgia. Like what, you know, the way the beginning of last year went, some people had questions. But when you sit down and talk to him and you hear his process, you hear his organization, you know, you hear how much football means to him and kind of the way that he studies it. But it's just impressive. It's really impressive to hear how much of a football nerd he is, so to speak, and I mean that in as positive way as possible. So I didn't really know what to think of him, what to make of him, because I haven't really heard him talk. So I was impressed with the young man and just kind of how he handles himself, how composed he was, and then just how detailed his football preparation is. And I think my overriding takeaway from the weekend was just physical. I don't even want to say physicality, but just the size that Georgia brings in certain spots. And I mean, I don't know. This doesn't mean, there's going to be people that listen to this and think that it means that they can't lose, or, that I think that they're just going to, Godzilla the city on the 2021 season. And it's not what I mean, but it's just, you asked me what my biggest takeaway was, and it was, they're physically different than I think anybody they're going to play. And I would include teams that they might see in the playoffs. I mean, they got a 6'7", 285-pound tight end who's got about a 32-inch waist. So people see 285 and they're like, oh, well, he'll move the tackle, or, oh, he can't run, or he can't move. Well, no, he actually can. And he the responses I get on Twitter, he can't catch. Well, I saw him catch 4 balls in the spring game. He's flexible. He's a willing blocker. Darnell Washington is a guy that you don't see a lot of. And Clemson fans are used to seeing some pretty freakish tight ends. I think Braden Galloway's got a chance to be great. But, I mean, this guy's just physically different. I mean, he looks like a basketball center. And then, I see Amarius Mims, freshman tackle prospect that's just, I mean, as good-looking a tackle prospect as a freshman that I've seen in a long time. I mean, 6'7", 325, small waist, big butt, big quads, arms going past his kneecaps. I mean, you don't see a lot of guys like that. They got a kid named Adam Anderson that's going to play star, which is, a hybrid safety position, which means he'll be in the alley a lot. Is 6'5", 230. Amir Speed at corner, 6'3", 211. Jordan Davis, defensive tackle, 6'6", 350. And he's next to Devonta Wyatt, who's 6'3", 325. They have 4 offensive linemen that have a chance to play that are all at least 6'6", 310. And again, I'm not saying it means they're going to win every game, but I just know they have characters on that team that are physically different than anybody they're going to play. Now, can they utilize that to their advantage every week? Is that going to give them certain advantages against certain teams that allow them to win? Yeah, maybe sometimes. But, I mean, that was really the biggest takeaway. I think corner and offensive line are 2 positions that need more development before they're going to be even good, much less great. But it's pretty apparent the talent is there. They're just inexperienced and young and hadn't played a lot of football together. So those are kind of the things that I think were glaring from what I saw, and maybe where my opinion has changed a little bit as opposed to what I thought about them going in.
So walking off the bus, it sounds like your classic Alabama team.
Yeah, a lot of it. But, I mean, I look at that Alabama team and I still think, Evan Neal's a monster tackle. But I don't know about the rest of those spots. Like, they got some big D linemen, but they don't have a lot of that other stuff that Georgia has.
Yeah. So to you, is it just sort of the culmination of all those highly regarded recruiting classes finally sort of bearing fruit?
I think that's part of Kirby's emphasis. I mean, I think he believes that, physicality can still help you win games, can still go a long way in winning games. You got to have a quarterback. You got to be balanced. Schematically, you got to be solid. Assignment, fundamentals, got to be good. But I just think he believes, and I do too, that there are going to be points in time when, if you can physically impose your will, even with just certain individuals in a game, it's going to give you massive advantages. And they've got a lot of guys across the board that should be able to do that.
With Monken and Daniels, they were not able to go through a spring last year. Of course, didn't have the normal offseason. Of course, they're going to be a lot better a year later, being able to go through the typical offseason routine. Is it through my eyes, Georgia's offense was under the radar, improved last year, just the way Monken was moving around the pieces, even though it's not like they were just, knocking everybody's socks off from a general perspective, I kind of like the direction there from what I saw, utilizing the running backs a lot in the passing game. And they have Alabama on the ropes and Tuscaloosa. Do you see it that way as well, that Monken might be I guess Monken plus Daniels is maybe the game changer for them?
Yeah, it's interesting when you say they didn't have a spring last year, but in reality, that part didn't even really matter. They didn't go into the fall knowing who their quarterback was going to be.
Yeah.
And I talked to Coach Monken on the field before the game. I said, I asked him how much different it was now than then, and he just went on night and day. He said it's got to be nice just knowing who you are, what you can try to attach, what you can try to build on, the things that you know you need to take away. Don't even waste your time with. Last year, he's been, and this is the thing that I said about Georgia going into last year that not a lot of people paid attention to, or maybe they just didn't believe it. But, when Newman decided not to play, or when he quit or whatever, it wasn't just the fact that you lost a guy that was pretty talented. Where that hurt the most, in my opinion, was you just had a guy steal 2 or 3 months of first-team reps.
Mm-hmm.
They were stolen from that team. And now you had to sort of hit the reset button. And that could literally be your 7-on-7 stuff that the guys are doing on their own during the summer. But still, that's where leaders are born. That's what Trevor Lawrence was taking guys out on the field the last 2 or 3 years during the summer, telling them where to line up, telling them when to break a route off early, telling them how to get out of a route, telling them what to do against certain coverage. That's where you develop some of that unspoken language, the chemistry of being able to look at a guy and all right, I'm going to break this route off a little bit quick, or okay, I can get him to the outside here. All that was gone because he was the one that was supposed to come in and do it. And then you had the Dwan Mathis, Stetson Bennett, and I think there was a little bit of the ghost of Justin Fields hanging around there where they probably wanted to make sure that Dwan Mathis wasn't going to go do what Justin did and have that happen 2 times in a row. Then Stetson ended up being their best opportunity to win games with. So just that juggling act alone early in the season, that's like, you can't build an offense like that. You're essentially just treading water at that point. Like, what can we even just feasibly get away with? So I think now you know exactly who you are. You know exactly what you're capable of, what your quarterback can handle, what everybody else around him can handle, how much responsibility you're able to give him. You're not going to give and take the amount of responsibility that a quarterback has. If there's a different guy that you need to put in for short yardage quarterback runs, if that's something that you wanted to do, you can do that. If there's a guy that can come in and help you do things from a route perspective, what that's going to look like. So I just think it's totally different. I really do. And now they're going to have an identity going into – they're not just having an identity going into the season. They have an identity going into the summer where they start preparing for the season. So I think that becomes a massive advantage for Coach Monken, for JT Daniels, and the rest of that offense.
And they seem to think that George Pickens, who tore his ACL recently, could be back late in the year.
Well, I think that's the desired outcome. I don't think anybody's predicting that.
Yeah.
But I've had two ACL surgeries. I know I've talked to other guys. I've seen it. I've watched it. I know. I've been in those cases. I know what the timeline is, and when you look at the timeline and you hear the fact that there was no other damage, and you see the fact that okay, this lines up to where if everything goes according to plan, you could potentially get him back for the home stretch. Whether it's the last 2 games, last 3 games of the regular season. You go 10, 15 snaps, you go, 18, 25 snaps, you go 30 snaps, and then SEC championship game, all of a sudden you've almost got him as a full-speed player. And the thing about an ACL is through a lot of your rehabilitation, you can actually do things that are going to get you ready to play football. Going full speed is always going to be different, but it's not like when I broke my 5th metatarsal and I had a screw put in and I'm in that boot. I can go train in the pool. I can go I can go do something on a zero gravity treadmill, but I mean, I'm not really out there on the field doing drills that translate to football. With an ACL, you can sort of do that. So I know that's his desired outcome. I know that's the team's desired outcome. A lot of things have to happen for that to take place. But, I mean, the reason that I would say that I think it's more probable than doubtful is just the fact that they both want it to happen and they're going to do everything they can. And that's already been stated, instead of where somebody's like, well, I don't even know if I was healthy, I'm going to come back, or we'll see where the team is. That's not the kind of chatter that you're getting around that deal.
And you think they'll be fine at receiver without him? That they're plenty talented?
I think, I think with Burton and Robertson and, this A.D. Mitchell that's coming in that they really like, I think they have enough numbers along with a really good tight end room. I mean, you still got Burton and Fitzpatrick to go along with Washington, which are different. I mean, Fitzpatrick, talking about big dudes. I mean, he's another 6'7", 250. Burton will be more of a move tight end that I think they can utilize a little bit. Then you have some backs that can do some different things. Like I think Cook is sort of your motion back. You line him up out wide. You give him some jets. You throw him the ball a little bit. And then you have a couple downhill backs like Zamir White that can be your in-between the tackles guys a little bit more often. There's enough around JT Daniels to offset losing one guy. And I think also in today's college football, if you're building an offense for one guy, I know what Devonta Smith just did, but I think we also know what else they had. When you have the ability to hand it to Najee behind a great offensive line, or use Billingsley at tight end, or Waddle at other times, or Mechie at other times. I mean, Mechie almost had 1,000 yards receiving last year, and people don't even talk about it. They don't even mention his name. So if you're building an offense for one guy, especially through the air, there's going to come a time where it's pretty tough to get that guy the ball. So I almost think it actually helps the development of JT Daniels a little bit more to not have that eraser, to not have that safety valve, to not have that get-out-of-jail-free card guy where, okay, well, I'm just going to give it to him. Or even have that mentality of, I got to keep this guy happy. I got to make sure he's feeling it. I got to make sure he's thinking positive things because we want him to stay tuned in. Now it's just, where's my best matchup? Where can I most easily win and help create an explosive play? And I don't know that that's just my opinion, but I actually think that could help his development as far as how he manages the entire offense a little bit.
Georgia has Alabama on the ropes in Tuscaloosa with Stetson Bennett at quarterback. And their other loss of the year against Florida, Bennett's banged up. And if they have a quarterback who can hit an open receiver downfield, they maybe beat Florida. I guess the point is Monken is putting those guys in the right positions. It seems like, what impresses you the most about his system, and how do you see him building upon that now with more resources and more sort of continuity going into this season?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that stick out when I watch his offenses. One is balance. Two is how it varies, the different variables that he'll give you. Three, kind of like what we talked about before, I don't think he locks on to just one or two guys. I think he game plans around a defense instead of going in saying, okay, we got to force this guy to ball, make sure this guy touches the ball X amount of times. And then I think now going in, he'll just be able to add a lot more to what can change before the snap and what can change after the snap, because he's got a guy that he knows can handle it. And, that's what playing quarterback's all about, is decision-making. You coach him what decisions to make, and then he's got to get out there and be able to do it. Now, that can go to timing, that can go to reads, that can go to anticipation, that can be knowing the defense, that can be knowing how the defense changes, that can be your protections, what protections will work, what won't work, what protections you need to get to, where pressure may be coming from. A lot of things can play into that and how that happens, but now he knows he's got it, so he'll be a little bit more advanced, I think, in just how he's able to attack people. And I think they want to become more explosive. I think part of what you saw the last 4 games, JT Daniels wanted to prove that he could get the ball down the field. There were a couple times when, I think there's even one, I was watching the film, and Kirby kind of looks frustrated when he sees the ball go downfield. It ends up being a long touchdown. So, I think he wanted to prove he could do it. Now they know he can do it. Now Monken can give him more of that. And, I expect it to be more consistent. more than anything else. It's not going to have to change as much one week to the next. The identity won't have to alter itself, based on who's at quarterback, who you're playing, who you have, who you don't have. And the other part of what you mentioned too about those games is those defenses were pretty beat up. Hell, I was on the sideline for the Kentucky game when it's like Jordan Davis goes out, and then you're already playing with a beat up inside linebacker, Monty Rice, who's like barely moving around. One safety goes out, next safety goes out, and you're sitting there thinking, okay, all of a sudden this defense is a mass unit. It's supposed to be one of the best in the country, and they're just trying to find guys who can go fill voids. So I think that's another part of kind of taking your approach and looking at the positives of what they were able to do last year, as opposed to just saying, oh, it was this massive letdown.
What do you make of Clemson, sort of the state of Clemson right now from the outside looking in? 2 years ago, you and I are talking about, hey, are they running away from everybody after they beat Alabama 44-16, and Nick Saban is hemorrhaging assistant coaches. And then a year later, LSU, the stars align, and they can't hang with them. And then a few months ago, they are just physically overwhelmed on both sides of the ball by Ohio State. What do you make of Clemson right now from what you've seen of them, just sort of big picture?
Well, first off, everybody gets got. And I will never judge a program on one game. So, whether it's LSU a couple years ago, which, I spent almost all of quarantine debating if that was the greatest offense that we had seen at the college level ever.
Yeah. And
when you look at the numbers and you look at who they did it against and where they did it, it's kind of hard to deny it. And that I think that Ohio State team was just something that just sort of happened. That was a little bit different. They had some matchups that worked, and they had some things that went their way early, and it was just kind of a little bit too much to overcome. My opinion of the program hasn't really changed much, and that's because they continue to reload with elite recruiting classes. And a little bit different than Nick Saban is Dabo's been able to hold on to a lot of his big name assistant coaches. He had an offensive coordinator that was up for a lot of jobs. A lot of people thought was leaving. You have one of the best defensive coordinators in college football that's still going to be there and continue to be problematic. And I think we all know what's coming up next at quarterback because we've had a chance to see him. And we know good and well what he's capable of. And if you have a guy that can do some of those things, you're probably going to win a lot of games. So, I think Clemson is, we've sort of turned this thing into a three-team conversation at this point on the calendar for the last few years, be it Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, in whatever order you want to discuss them. And then it's, okay, who's the other team that's going to show up to the table? Is it LSU? Is it Notre Dame? Is it Georgia? Is it Oregon? Who's going to be the team that decides this year, they either have what it takes or want to be what it takes, and they're going to get on that stage and be able to compete. So, I look at this year as there are definitely more maybes and what ifs. You look at a Justin Ross. What if he's able to come back and be what we've already seen him be? That's a big difference maker. I think we all believe that DJ can be as big time of a college quarterback as there's going to be next year, which it doesn't even look like there's a clear number one. Like, who's QB1 going into next year? Is it Slovis, JT Daniels? Some people might try to throw in De'Aaron King. Is it Matt Corral? I don't think that there's just that guy like there has been the last 3 years. It's been Trevor Lawrence. We've known that. And now we don't really know who QB1 is going into this year, but we know what DJ is capable of because we've seen it. I think you're going to have one of the better defensive lines in all of college football, and they'll have extra advantages because they're going to be given the capabilities to attack on a regular basis because that's what Venables does. And he's brilliant with how he mixes things up and changes things around. And I think that, too, if you want to go to the other side of that, like I said, they're legitimate concerns. I have no idea what, I talk about college football fans a lot, Larry, in that one thing that's disappointing about college football fans is how quickly we forget greatness and how quickly we just move on from greatness and anticipate the next thing is going to be as good or better. the lack of appreciation for how good Travis Etienne has been the last few years, to me, is a little bit staggering. And when I point that finger, it's not at Clemson fans. It's at college football fans. Because, I mean, that guy had to sort of change who he was last year, and he was still as impactful. And he goes down as the ACC's all-time pretty much everything at tailback statistically. And I just think people are like, oh, yeah, well, it's running back. They'll find another guy. And he was pretty special.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you just replace special with even more special or as special. So I think that's a big loss. And I think the offensive line still has some growing up to do. That's been an area that I've pointed to the last few years that I don't think is one that Clemson really wins games with. I think they get by more so, and a lot of that is because of guys like Travis Etienne, Trevor Lawrence, and Justin Ross, and Amari Rodgers, and different players on the perimeter or skill guys that can turn high percentage plays into explosive plays. But at some point in time, I mean, you're going to come down to a situation where that group needs to go win you a game or win you a possession. I mean, I remember the Boston College game a couple of years ago when Trevor went out, and it was like the last 3-4 series of that game, all of a sudden this light switch came on. And that group just started kicking everybody's ass for 2 or 3 series. And you're like, well, where's that been? And that's the reason they thought they won the game. So you're going to need that group, whether it's short yardage, red zone, certain matchups, particular team, another team physically, what they bring to the table, that they're going to have to go win games for you. I still believe that physicality wins games. I still believe games ultimately are won or lost in the trenches. Just look at the Super Bowl. Look what Alabama did to Ohio State. I still think that, we keep talking about defense and how defense doesn't win championships, but Tampa's defense is pretty good. Bama held Notre Dame and Ohio State to under 400 total yards in both those playoff games. So I still think defense can win championships, and I still think you need to win in the trenches. And I actually look at that Georgia-Clemson game, and I see 2 groups on the offensive line that are talented. One with Georgia that probably just doesn't have the experience together. They're going to need a lot of continuity, and they're going to need to grow with chemistry and understanding and wherewithal. And then one with Clemson that just physically needs to grow up. I think the group that plays the best there probably wins that game. Because you have 2 great defensive lines, maybe the 2 best defensive lines in the nation. So if you can't neutralize that opponent right there, that's going to go a long way in you finding any success offensively. And then, you got 2 quarterbacks that are extremely valuable that are going to need to be protected at the same time. So, and 2 defenses that are very aggressive. So you're going to have not only the physical prowess, but the brain power to be able to understand what's coming, recognizing the fronts, seeing the pressures, picking up the stunts, and handling all of that. So, I kind of look at those 2 teams talent-wise very close across the board, some better than the other in certain places. Some have matchup advantages in some places, but I'm kind of leaning towards the offensive line that plays the best in that game, probably going to take home the W.
Almost makes you wonder if it's going to be like a 16-13 game based on how good those defensive lines are against some questionable offensive lines.
Yeah, and I think Georgia, you do have questions in the secondary. So could you see Uyunglele going for 400? Maybe, if they find the matchups they like and they get that protection. I think same thing with JT. If they get a little pressure happy and all of a sudden Georgia's able to get a couple big tight ends in, they pick it up. There could be explosive plays that they could generate. So I just think whoever handles their business up front on offense in that game the best, most likely that team's probably going to win.
Have you had a chance to watch Bryce Young's showing in the Bama spring game?
Yeah, I've watched it a few times. I think Twitch is the first thing that comes to mind. He really can change what he's doing very quickly. He can change direction. He can change where the ball's going. He can get the ball out. He can turn from a runner to a passer very quickly. He can go from surveying the left side of the field all the way to the right side of the field and get it out in a hurry. He can get from start to stop in a hurry. He's very twitchy, and I'm not going to dare make the player comp of who comes to mind, but there's not a lot of guys that have that kind of bounce in the pocket. And that kind of ability that quickly to be able to move and be different, basically turn into a different player that quickly with the ball in their hands behind the line of scrimmage. He has the ability to do that. Some of the accuracy didn't look great at times. I think understanding of, ball velocity, ball tempo, elevation on the ball, how to level it at certain points, those things will probably come with more experience. But, talent, no question about that. And, it's just feels like they're just reloading. Roydell Williams looks great at tailback. This Ajay Hall kid just looks like the next, number one Alabama receiver, maybe with a bigger catch radius than the last few guys we've seen. So Billingsley's going to be solid at tight end. Evan Neal's going to left tackle. That looks like it's going to be fine. So he'll have plenty of weapons around him to help any of the deficiencies that he might have early in his career.
All right, Cole, should be fun. Always enjoy talking big-time football with you, and appreciate all your really good insight. And it comes from a lot of homework, you can tell. So thanks for your time, man, and safe travels this weekend.
Absolutely, Larry. I appreciate you having me on.
If you're in the Eastern Midlands and PD area, and you're in any way interested in buying and selling a home, commercial property, land, need to consider reaching out to Uptown Realty. They're based out of Sumter and run by a friend of mine, Patrick Enzer, big Clemson guy, used to cover the Tigers in a newspaper capacity, longtime supporter of Tiger Illustrated, longtime listener to the Dubcast. The home buying process should be an enjoyable experience, so let Patrick and his staff do all the heavy lifting. All you got to do is pick up the phone and call 803-774-0435 or go to uptownrealtysc.com. Celero Communications, formerly known as Tandem Payment, is a full-service integrated electronic payments provider powered by leading-edge technology. Celero provides a wide array of merchant solutions, simplified payments. They make onboarding, taking payments, maintaining risk management and compliance, and getting support quick and easy. At Celero, they're all about helping you achieve sustainable growth as a business. Taking payments isn't the only thing your business needs. With Celero's solutions, you can manage inventory, sell products and services via social media, schedule staff, track sales, get reports, and much, much more. Find out more about Celero at celerocommerce.com. That's CELERO commerce.com. At Harris Home and Harris Commercial, they want you to get every detail right. Harris means beautiful design that delivers taste, style, and comfort. It's a legacy of integrity built by generations of outstanding reliability and service. It's all about creating just the right look, the perfect feel, and dependable function for every room in your home or any business setting. Folks at Harris are Clemson people based in Anderson. A lot of Clemson University's recent facilities improvements have Harris's fingerprints all over them. For endless flooring possibilities and breathtaking renovation, the only name you need to know is Harris. Website is discoverharris.com. Okay, joined by Pete Yanity, WSPA Sports Director. How you doing, man?
I am doing just great. It is an honor. I'm making my second appearance on what has become a world famous, in fact, I'd say a planetary famous podcast.
So you texted me yesterday about you'd read some of the Danny Ford reminiscences, I guess. And it's really interesting how I'm getting various correspondence from folks who were around back then. I was around back then, but not in a professional capacity. So and I don't want to start this with a monologue, but the most interesting thing to me is that this series actually ran back in 2012.
Yep.
Summer of 12. And the way it is received now in the midst of unfathomable brilliance by Dabo Swinney and Clemson's football program is much different from the way it was received 6 months after 70 to 33. Like back then it's like,
yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
I mean, back then it's like, okay, there was still a great attachment to the glory days. There was still this notion, I don't know about this Dabo guy. Yep. And he's a good coach. They won the ACC, but he's no Danny. Whereas now, when you read it, it's like it's the exact opposite. Danny was no Dabo. It's
That's
kind
a
of
really
amazing.
interesting way to put it. Yeah, and just your excellent book that came out about the rivalry Is that what you're referring to? The rivalry book that featured a lot of the Danny Ford items?
No. This series that ran the last 2.5 weeks at TigerIllustrated.com, it actually ran in 2012 for the first time, and we decided to rerun it recently.
Gotcha.
So
interesting.
Yeah, and so everything that has been published in recent weeks was published in the summer of 2012 on our website. We just figured now would be a good time to publish it again. 9 years.
Wow.
And I did not I just was sort of like, okay, yeah, we that's fine.
Sure.
We're doing the series. It actually, it benefits me because I actually was able to take some time off. I didn't have to really do a whole lot of work. And so, but it didn't really hit me until I started reading it again, and then hearing and seeing what people were saying on our message board. Like, wow, man, those were some really tumultuous times. It just seemed like every other week there was something happening, like a total roller coaster, even despite the national championship, despite the 10-win seasons and prominence and all that. It was a tough time. Just because of all the controversies that seemed like they were happening on a regular basis.
Well, your head's spinning back really from, you could argue, from late in that 1980 season when it looked like Danny, might get run out, because folks were saying then, and I wasn't in the state at the time, but I've read enough, learned enough, talked enough to people about it. It's so funny, the parallels of Dabo and Danny, and that's another one, because folks were saying, gosh, is this the right guy? He's no Charlie Pell. And obviously you just said, as folks were saying early on in Dabo's run, yeah, but he's no Danny. But just by the way, to backstep on the rivalry book, quaint story you'll appreciate, December of 11, we're flying out. I had a Clemson at Arizona basketball game for the radio network, and I picked up your book and started reading it at the start of that trip. We actually had to stop. It's the only time it's ever happened on a chartered flight, I guess, since we were flying from Greenville to Tucson, Arizona. We actually stopped in Oklahoma City to refuel, and it wasn't until we were on the ground for a few minutes that I suddenly realized, we're not flying. What's going on? And someone said, we've stopped in Oklahoma City to refuel. That's how into that book I was. I believe I read the entire book on the flight out to Tucson, because some of those moments, like the prank that USC pulled with the players going out in the Clemson uniforms before a game in the 60s. That's the first time, for as much as I was into the rivalry and had called games and or whatever, I'd never heard that story from folklore or whatever until I read it in your book. But then obviously anything from mid-'80s on, I pretty much lived, and it was just fascinating going back through a lot of that. But that was a nod to your book. So anyone listening who's never bought Larry's book about the rivalry, I'm sure it's found on Amazon and in better bookstores near you. So you need to read that.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a friend, Brian Strickland, high school football coach.
I know him well.
Yeah, he coached at JL Mann, and Rodney Williams helped out. Yep. I think they remain close. And I was chit chatting with Brian, I think just a few days ago, and he said that somehow I guess it might have been the reason this came up was because Brian was reading the Danny Ford series on the website, but he said, man, that 87 game in Columbia where Rodney threw the pick six to Brad Edwards, his hometown, he's getting serenaded with chants of his name, and it's like just a total nightmare evening for him, one of the worst nights of his life, you would think. And Brian asked Rodney, hey man, you probably couldn't get out of Columbia quick enough that night. And Rodney said, huh? He said, I went down to 5 Points and hung out with Todd Ellis and Brad Edwards.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's part of that's my favorite sort of, I think that's my favorite part of the rivalry book, sort of the revelation, because we explored that, like how, in the middle of this cutthroat rivalry that's so monumental to everyone, these college kids are still being college kids, once the playing is over. So it's
a great point. Yeah, it's such a great point. And it'd be interesting to do a study on how many former Clemson and Carolina football players went into business with each other at some point in their lives. Obviously there are a lot of alums and or fans of the programs that have done business relationships. And of course, then we hear the famous stories of, I got to hear it at work 364 days until the next game. But how many business relationships were developed among former Clemson and Carolina football players? And, it's really interesting, Larry. I was in the state for the 85 game, which was about an 8-point Clemson win in a battle of teams that were going to finish around 500 to see who would get a bowl bid. And so Clemson won that. I physically didn't cover that game. And then I was working in West Virginia in 86 for the, I think you'd say more infamous than anything, tie ball game that also featured some Brad Edwards stellar plays. But I either covered or called every Clemson Carolina game from 87 to 2013. And there were really good games in that stretch. And the 1987 game, maybe it's because it's the first one I attended in person, which was a 27-6 Carolina win. But I remember that game, the specifics of that game, probably more than even the dozen or so, nearly dozen Clemson Carolina games that I later actually called on the radio. Because I vividly remember Terry Allen being carted off with his leg up because he got hurt in that game.
Was it that? I thought that was
that might have been 80, that was 89. That was 89. Okay, that was 89. But 87, I vividly remember the Rodney chant. I vividly remember Ed McDaniel after the fact saying, I think he might have been a true freshman on the bench, that he was actually scared. You know what I mean? Standing on the sidelines that night, the Clemson linebacker, and he Ed McDaniel saying that, and I'm remembering that atmosphere because I was in the open. They had an open air kind of a photo deck where I was positioned during that game, and I could understand that. But the Rodney chant, the Brad Edwards play, Allen was 89, and I always remember because they were both night games. But I remember him being carted off 89, which was probably the only bad thing that happened that night for Clemson. But that 87 game, so much of it stands out, and maybe it's because it was the first one I attended in person.
Mm-hmm. Yes, back to the Danny sort of Dabo theme. I had to sort of remind myself and think back to the beginning of Dabo's tenure as head coach, just trying to, get a grasp of how big Danny still was back then. I distinctly remember it was a common question to Dabo from media members and from fans too, like, hey, when is he going to go establish a relationship with Danny Ford? Is he going to go to the farm? And this is really important because he needs to build that bridge with Danny because Danny can help him. And Danny has this wisdom and knowledge. And, I never really got the sense that it was that important to Dabo. Like, not that he had any ill will or anything toward him. I think Danny just keeps to himself and doesn't really want to be around that much. And then Dabo's trying to build his own culture. And then on top of that, Dabo knew and knows that, hey, man, and probably never would say it publicly, but, you guys were on probation most of that time, and so I want to do it the right way. And not to dominate this conversation, but in that same summer of 2012, when we turned that series of articles on Danny into a book, The Danny Ford Years at Clemson, and I gave Dabo a copy of it over at the July dinner thing that he has every summer before the previous golf outing and all that, so the kickoff to the season. And I gave him a copy of the book, and he's like, wow, okay, thanks. He's thumbing through it, and he goes, I just got one question. I go, okay. He goes, did he ever lose a game? And he was saying it in a joking way. Yeah. But even as recently as 2012, it's like almost like this sort of revisionist history in the eyes of some people. Mm-hmm. It's romanticized and glorified excessively to the point where you forget about the finer points and the aforementioned sort of roller coaster ride with all the different controversies and such.
But you see, I hear that, and I vividly remember Danny Ford when they were talking about adding even more seats onto Death Valley, and I'm pretty sure this was after they'd finished both upper decks. because I'm pretty sure, I heard, because in other words, it was 82, 81, 82, whatever it was that they added they finished the second upper deck. But I remember they were talking about adding more seats, and Danny Ford's response, and this is mid to late 80s, oh, geez, that's that many more people that can come in the stadium and yell at me and boo me. and again, keep in mind, I get to the state of South Carolina over in the PD area where, folks that have never lived in the PD, you have to realize that's as much Clemson country as anything. You've got a huge Clemson Ag Center in Darlington that's been there forever that is a huge presence. And then obviously all the agricultural connections for Clemson for obvious reasons. And, I get to the state in August 85, and it'll help Dabo to know that for as ever low as he may have felt coming out of 2010, Danny Ford had won a national title in 81. And the general thought I got was very tepid among Clemson fans at best at that point about Danny Ford, because, again, they're having come out of the probation. They dipped down to 7 wins. And then 85, of course, they've got this kid from Spartanburg and this kid from Irmo battling at quarterback, and they decided to go with the kid from Irmo, even though the one from Spartanburg looked like he could be more of a big-time college quarterback. But the kid from Irmo ran the option, I believe, better, and I think that's what their decision was. But they go out, they seemed like every time you looked up, it was the first year CBS had a big contract for college football. If it wasn't the first, it was the second, because the court ruling had happened in the summer of 84 that opened all that up. And I'm a weekend guy over in Florence, and I'm often in the station, obviously, on Saturdays, but Clemson was on several Saturdays on our channel. I was at a CBS affiliate. And again, the close loss to Georgia in 85. And, there was a close win here, a close loss, and they end up going 6-5, and they lose to Minnesota with an interim coach in the Independence Bowl. But, going into the 1986 season, I was here for the off season. I left the state in March of 86, returned in March of 87. But you kind of got the impression that South Carolina was the program on the uptick. And because they were, 2 years, they were just removed from the fire ant season of 84, had kind of a mediocre year in 85, but everyone thought it was going to be 84 all over again coming up. And if you were to drop Dabo Swinney in this state in the off season going into 1986, you would very much think, he would very much think that, boy, this Danny Ford guy barely, was saving his job. Of course, has the decent season in 86, beats Stanford, and then we know what happened from there. So just it's so funny because revisionist history, I think, can work two ways. And sure, he's gilded, and in many respects should be, because you could argue with an NFL defense coming back in 1990, and that's still one of the greatest personnel defenses I've ever seen in person in 1990 that Clemson had. With just enough offense, they would have very much probably been playing on New Year's Day for the national title in 1990. Had Danny stayed in place, or had the Virginia game for Ken Hatfield not been his second, maybe been a little bit later in the year, and given him and his staff just a few more weeks to kind of get fully comfortable in games. But that's my take on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, it's been very common over the decades for Clemson folks to say, if had things not gone sideways and Danny remained, and that 1990 team was so loaded that they would have played for a national title. But then there's another school of thought that I've heard in recent weeks from some folks who were around back then who are like, well, not necessarily, because something that's also, I think, sort of conveniently forgotten about that era, and something that has not sort of bedeviled Dabo during his tenure, is every year they would have this loss that they shouldn't have had. Mm-hmm. Sure. In 89, his last year, they go down to Florida State and just bludgeon a powerhouse Seminoles team. And so you're thinking then, okay, this is a national championship team. Then they go and stub their toes.
Beat Virginia Tech, I think, and then the Duke game. Yeah,
they lose at Duke, although a pretty darn good Duke team finishes 8-4. Steve Spurrier is the coach, but they lose that game, and then they lose at home to a rising Georgia Tech team under Bobby Ross. But still, they get drilled 30-14 at home.
Yep, could never get it going
against Georgia Tech. And then previous to that, there's like the one instance that stands out to me is the 87 game against NC State and Dick Sheridan at Death Valley, Now, Sheridan otherwise had the Wolfpack really good during that sort of span of time, but not in 87. NC State was a 4-7 team, and they're up 30-0 at halftime at Clemson, which, this is not the 2020 version of offensive football where teams score 30 points and a half routinely. This is like the dark ages of offensive football, and I still can't really fathom that. Of course, Clemson came back and almost won, lost 30-28. But the point is, there were every year it seemed like they had a game where they just sort of fell on their faces, which is a credit to, I think, Dabo and his sort of body of work. Is they don't really they don't have a high frequency or even a medium frequency of those games, and that's hard to do to avoid those slip-ups, whether you're talking about the 1980s or whether you're talking about other teams now, other really, really good programs now.
To their credit, and especially, I think you could probably point to, when was the last time you could say that the LSU game and then the Ohio State game are the only two games that I can think of that, and to a certain extent, the Alabama semifinal loss in 2017. But you just kind of felt like Clemson was in that game until things got sideways, like in the third quarter. But the LSU title game and the Ohio State semifinal game are the only two games that mid-second quarter I have thought to myself since really, the third quarter of the West Virginia Bowl game that, gosh, Clemson might not win this game.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm off on that. But, a couple of thoughts real quick. Just to jump back to if you were to drop Dabo in 1986, let's also not forget what turned out to be a pretty good 1986 season. Began with a 2-point loss at home against Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
And that was a 10-win Virginia Tech team in which Bill Dooley pretty much knew from the start of that year that he was going to get canned at the end of the season. I say 10 wins. They might have gone 9-2-1, but they won a lot of games. And a story that a Clemson player who's no longer with us once told me is that it was after that game, I'm pretty sure, or it was halftime of the 87 NC State game, but Danny Ford comes in. I'm 99% sure it was after the Virginia Tech loss. And he comes into the locker room and screaming at the top of his lungs says, "What kind of good time are you having now? What kind of good time are you having now?" to his whole team. And, of course, the rest of the way, they end up with a loss and 2 ties the rest of the way. But then the 87 game's interesting because, they're down 30-0 at the half. They lose by 2, 30-28. And that was 87, in which earlier, within just a few weeks, maybe within a month before that, to this day, probably the greatest college football game I've ever seen in person. I was there covering for the TV station. Was Georgia-Clemson in Death Valley on a rainy day. You had Rodney Hampton. You had Terry Allen. You had talent on unbelievable talent. To go back and watch that game, you had the safety coming up, James Lott forcing it, and James Earl making the tackle for the safety on James Johnson. There were 3 James involved in a play that led to a key safety that then put them in a position for Treadwell to eventually kick the winning field goal. Unbelievable football game, and then that. But you are absolutely correct. They would have, and if back then you'd had social media, and other than back then you had newspapers were probably the dominant media still, TV stations, some sports talk shows, pretty much the one in the evening that's still in existence in this state, not so much local, but you probably would have had the term Clemsoning coined back then. Because you could argue that, I always thought that was a stupid term anyway, because you could apply that to every program in the country. But let me also say this. The ardent Clemson fan who experienced 1989 will quickly point out to you, those who are in the know of this, and most of the diehards who followed the program back then will tell you, the week of the Duke game, which was played in the rain, and that was actually, they had beaten Maryland on the Saturday after Hurricane Hugo. They played, and that was when Terry Allen, and now the whole 89 thing comes back together. That was the first time Terry Allen got hurt that season. He got hurt against Maryland and then re-injured against South Carolina later. But anyway, they played Maryland at home on the Saturday after Hugo, and South Carolina played Georgia Tech that night in Columbia, where Hugo just kind of grazed by. And I'll never forget it because I was in Florence. We didn't have any power. I went over and covered the game in Columbia, covered for my station, but also so I could go out and get a nice meal at a place that had power after I covered the game. And then they beat Maryland. So then the following Saturday, South Carolina went in on a rainy Saturday, beat Georgia, and I remember being in the press box at Georgia covering that South Carolina game and watching a very somber and sad-looking Chris Morocco walk off the field after the decisive play on a rainy day at Duke. But the ardent Clemson fan who was around back then will tell you the week of the Duke game and the week of the Georgia Tech game, the NCAA was on campus investigating and asking questions. Mm-hmm. Those weeks of those games, and those were the distractions. I'm simply reporting to you what more than one Clemson fan has mentioned to me over the years, that the NCAA investigated those 2 weeks, and those who've told me that choose to tie in a parallel between the team's performance on the following Saturday of those respective weeks. And again, little do we know that Georgia Tech team with the young Sean Jones and Bobby Ross now maybe a year into that coaching run, maybe a couple of years, because he replaced Bill Curry after the 86 season. Ross left Maryland. So by then, Bobby Ross has it going. And a year later, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it 1990 that Georgia Tech shared the national championship?
That's correct.
Yeah, so that was a better team. And I remember being at Danny. So I'm still in Florence at the time. And one of the reasons I've always felt like I had a kind of a special relationship with Danny Ford, I mean, not buddy-buddy, but very cordial, very professional, but very friendly, was that so every Tuesday I'd get up in Florence at 6 a.m., do the 11 o'clock news the night before, Tuesday in the fall we're talking about, so it's 10 or 11 Tuesdays in the fall, get in the car at 6 a.m., meet some other media guys in Columbia. We would drive up to the upstate and interview Danny and a couple of players they'd make available for us, and they served us some kind of great lunch. And while we ate, the scribes, newspaper guys, they would ask their questions. It was kind of a roundtable thing that we would also listen in on. But I'll never forget, we're going up there, and this is a Clemson team. Yeah, they'd lost to Duke, but boy, they were probably still in the hunt for the title. They were probably going to win the AC. And Danny Ford, several times, both in talking to the broadcast media and then talking to the scribes, kept saying, Georgia Tech is going to be good. They're going to be good. Don't look, they're going to be good. And I'm thinking, every coach says this, whatever. And then lo and behold, Sean Jones kind of had his coming out party.
Can we recreate the picture going into the Gator Bowl? And when you first, so you give an idea of the rumblings, as I wrote, Danny Sheridan, who was then at CNN. Yep. He reported, I guess, a week before the Gator Bowl against West Virginia that Ford would leave Clemson after the season. I'm wondering, so they had destroyed South Carolina in Columbia 45-0. And then, so I'm just curious if you can recall the timeline and when you started to sort of get a feeling that that something might happen here. Did it date all the way back to the summer when Ford popped off about the lack of an athletic dorm and called out the administration, or was it more sort of pronounced in the weeks leading up to the Gator Bowl, and why? I'm just curious what it was like to be covering that.
Here's what I remember, and keep in mind at the time I'm 2.5, 3 hours away from Clemson on the eastern side of the state, in an era where, at the time, interestingly, both the State and the Greenville News were both statewide newspapers. Mm-hmm. So I was getting, that's where you got a lot of information. Obviously, I'd call Clemson Sports Information, talk with them, had some very good media contacts in the state. We'd share some thoughts. My recollection is you'd heard that there was a little bit of you'd heard that Danny really wanted an athletic dorm. You'd heard that Clemson was going to build this building that was going to have be a tutoring center for the players, to which I thought, gosh, they don't have that with all else they've got. Because, back then, mid to late 80s, Clemson still, the stadium still, was, I thought, sterling, and you thought that Clemson was right there, had everything they needed for football. It's like, wow, they didn't have something like that? You would have thought that. And, of course, we learned later on that the NCAA, this was right around the time they passed, Proposition 48 became Bylaw 51J about cleaning up the academics. And now their next move was going to be on having athletic-only dorms. And at the time, no one realized that. But, again, after the fact, looking back in history, you're told one of the reasons Clemson wasn't going to go down that road was because they were told the NCAA was probably going to legislate out athletic dorms, so it didn't make sense to try to move forward with a football dorm. On top of that, the determination was, look, if the NCAA is getting tougher on academic standards, and this is long before the Jim Barker vision of trying to, further step up the game of the institution from an academic standpoint. I think the practical thing, and I'm sure Clemson wasn't the only athletic department that was having these very deep conversations, was we need to do some things to further enhance what we're doing academically with football players front and center in mind, but I would think with all athletes, all the student athletes. And of course, so then there were some murmurs, and apparently there was an IPTAY meeting that was heavily attended, in which, as the story goes, I was not there. I've only heard the rekindlings of it. I'm not too far off on what I've heard, but apparently Danny Ford made a point to a big gathering of Clemson fans, and that he thought he needed what he needed, as opposed to what the academic side of things was. Now, here's what I don't know, and no one's ever further clarified it. I can't tell you, and I've never asked Danny about this. I don't think he was opposed to, Danny Ford's one of the smartest human beings I've ever met in my life. I mean, he really is. And then he was an academic, all-conference player at Alabama. He's probably, he's one of these guys that is probably so shrewd with his money that he could, probably take care of his family for 10 generations for all I know. But I do know that he was adamant that he needed an athletic dorm. That's what I know. I can't tell you what his feelings were about everything else to go along with it. I've heard some things, but I've never had it verified. You got a sense that it was kind of business as usual. And I was up at Clemson every week. I didn't sense that anything was amiss. Preseason came up when they had some media opportunities. You got the impression everything was all fine. And what you kept hearing about was maybe this is, maybe we're all the way back from the probation era. You had, again, the makings of an unbelievable defense. You had the emergence of Levon Kirkland, which was way under the radar in the 88 season, to go along with John Johnson, an outside linebacker who came in at the same time Kirkland did, with all the plaudits and all the in this era, 5-star stuff, who had a really good career, but I always thought Kirkland had a better career. Anyway, you got the sense that it was all about they were going to win this year and it was going to be great. Now, maybe the thought was they win a national title, they're going to give Danny anything he wants and everyone's going to live happily ever after, or those who, he's butting heads with, may not be long for the place. But I didn't get a sense back then. It didn't seem to be the columnists were very influential. I don't remember any deep columns being written about the imminence of Danny Ford's departure from Clemson. And I think that speaks to the fact that, per your excellent coverage and series, when you point out that, on the morning of Thursday, January 18th, there was nothing in the local newspaper about it. And believe you me, I was plugged in enough at the time that those who I talked to on a daily basis would have heard within media circles would have said, hey, we're on the edge, because 4 years later, we, using that same process, we were out in front of the whole Hatfield story. So in terms of his departure, so it was not a murmur. It was up until that morning. It was not, as best I recall, it's not something you thought, this might happen, as opposed to 2008 when they lose that opening game of the year and then things are starting to go south. And I never thought that the whole Bowden thing would happen in the middle of the year. I thought maybe they'd give him another year, but make changes on his staff, since they'd just given him a contract extension the previous December. But with Ford, I don't remember ever getting a sense that, wow, anything could happen. And this Danny Sheridan guy making that prediction, he's an odds maker. Maybe he's just trying to get some action in Vegas. He's an Alabama guy, though, so I thought maybe he knows something. He was from Mobile, Alabama. Maybe he's got some people in Alabama that know Danny. That was the only thought from me.
Yeah. And so it happens. Did you come up here and were you present for the protests and all that stuff?
I physically was not. The way things were set up back then, staffing wise, what we covered and we were owned by the same company and the same company that owns Channel 7 owns the station I worked at in Florence. And it was one of those situations, as I think back on it, I think, so we were a 2-man staff, and I think my number 2 guy, it was one of these deals where his wife was about to have their first child. who has since, by the way, that child is now married and has a child of her own, which tells you how long ago it was. And I was one of those deals where he was maybe out on, like imminent maternity leave or, I couldn't go too far. And so just the way we worked it. And again, you really didn't know that Ken Hatfield was being brought in until Ken Hatfield was brought in on that Sunday morning. It was a situation where the way things will work in TV, we'll always swap video. Those closest get things. You eventually, if you're further away, you eventually come to the story, but you didn't know really what story to go to because, it was you'd heard, well, maybe, the Stacey Fields guy and Van Salmon and some others are talking about doing a vigil in front of the president's house, and then it kind of happened. So I was not physically on the ground at Clemson for the weekend. And again, that Thursday morning, we get word, we started getting word around 10:30, maybe 10 a.m. at the earliest. I got a call from, one of my buddies at my house. No cell phones back then, no internet. So you really didn't know what to come up and cover. So you're thinking, well, you go up there on a Saturday. And again, we're in basketball season. I think I probably went and covered a basketball game. And again, being in Florence, there were things you'd cover, Columbia was in between there and Clemson. It was probably a 60-40, maybe a 55-45 fan breakdown in the Florence area, USC to Clemson. My opinion might be off a little bit, but it was pretty close to 50-50, but might have been just a little bit more USC. So anyway, my first time though back up at Clemson after all that had gone down is about week and a half later. Ken Hatfield's in place, and then they were letting stations come up and do one-on-one interviews with him. So I come up and interviewed him in his. This is something that a William Sweeney would appreciate now. I went into Ken Hatfield's office, and I was one-man banding, meaning you set your camera up, you frame the interview person, put a microphone on him, you do the interview, you're rolling and keeping an eye on the viewfinder. We did it in his office in the corner of the Jervey Athletic Center, which is now, it's the closest part to the perpendicular to the Avenue of Champions. If you go in that lobby, it was just to the left. I don't know if that's a women's basketball office now, or I don't know what that is now. I don't think it's women's basketball because I think they're over in Little John. But anyway, he had this tiny little corner office in Jervey, which is, it's just so funny to think. And that had been Danny Ford's office. So it's just so funny to think how things have evolved.
Yeah, the players were threatening to boycott the 1990 season at one point.
Absolutely. Yeah, so all that, and then we made the joke. It's funny. I was up here by I got up here at about the 2/3 of the way into the 1990 season, but I physically got up to Channel 7 in the upstate. And then in the 91 season, of course, they played Cal to end that season, and we were driving down to Florida to go cover that bowl game, and we're just kind of joking. It's interesting. In the 60s at Cal Berkeley, they were protesting the war, and here in the early 90s at Clemson, they've been protesting the coaching change, because you can talk about that moment on Thursday, January 18th, 1990, but that began essentially a decade of, you did Danny wrong. We're angry about Danny. Poor Ken Hatfield, such a great man, an excellent football coach. Sometimes people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. You wouldn't find a better quality person. Look, Danny Ford is a good man. And I'm sure Danny Ford felt badly that Ken Hatfield had to go through what he went through, because, from the time it's just not often that a guy pulls up for his introductory news conference outside of the football stadium where he's now going to try to win a lot of games. And there's a collection of folks there, and they're not there to welcome him with open arms. Let's put it that way. So you combine that was a Sunday morning of that weekend. It was the Friday night of that weekend. I believe it was a Friday. I could be wrong. Maybe it was a Saturday night. I'm pretty sure it was the Friday night, the day after everything happened. They do the candlelight vigil outside of the president's home on the Clemson campus. The players were front and center in that. And it just, I vividly remember within the week of Ken Hatfield getting hired, the first time I ever interviewed him was actually over in Florence, so this is late January of 90. Maybe it's the first week of February, but I think I interviewed him over there before I came to the upstate to do a one-on-one with him. And, they had an IPTAY gathering in Florence. That's back when they used to do about 32 IPTAY stops a year all over the state. And usually the football and basketball coach would do about a third to two-thirds of them and whatever. So, and God love the IPTAY folks in Florence trying to put the best face on this thing. And, they had little signs, Hatfield is the real McCoy. And just, trying to make the best. And you could just feel the tension in the room, and you could just sense it just, because usually those are exciting events. And, the Gamecock people would do the same thing, and some of the other state schools. And it was a neat deal, and everyone would come out wearing their school colors. They'd have a dinner at some restaurant in Florence. And it was just, sometimes we'd go live out there. The coach would join us, and it just had such a weird, eerie feeling to it. And it was within, I'm pretty sure maybe I'd already interviewed Hatfield in the upstate, and then I interviewed him again. But so he gets there, and he's, and again, couldn't have been a more gracious guy. And then, of course, I got to know him even more because his last 2 years, I actually hosted and produced his TV show. In, one of my many iterations, working from the inside from the Clemson standpoint. And so I got to know him even more. And what I'd always thought was a real good guy covering his news conference, whatever. You do a TV show with a coach, you get to chat with them a little bit while they're, you're waiting for things to start rolling. So, it in the end will always be termed a separation that he had with Clemson. It was probably best for all parties. He'd had a difficult time at his alma mater, Arkansas, from what I was told, that it was an opportunity that he thought was going to, be a better move for him personally and professionally at the time, getting away from Arkansas. And obviously, I think, had he stepped back, he would have rethought things.
Thinking back to the separation, it's kind of fascinating to wonder, like, had social media been around then and been as widespread as it is now, you wonder, I think it's a legitimate question, would the resistance have been powerful enough to reverse the decision?
I don't know. I mean, because it was coming from above. And again, I always felt badly for Bobby Robinson because I vividly remember seeing him at that function I was telling you about in Florence. And the poor guy looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in, weeks. I mean, my God, I felt so bad. I dealt with him a couple of times. Very nice guy, and obviously got to know him, really well once I moved up here especially. And I always felt badly for him. You have to wonder, it just maybe even if things were – you just had a president in place who actually was a very big sports fan. I did a double take one time many years later, long after Max Lennon had completed his time as Clemson's president. We're talking 15 years later. I'm getting on an elevator at a hotel in Greensboro, ACC tournament weekend, and there he is. I'm like, Dr. Lennon, how are you? Shook his hand. And I'd gotten to know him a little bit. I guess I'd interviewed him. I didn't interview him around the Ford thing, but I'd interviewed him at some other points in time. And, how you doing? We're back. I have ACC basketball tickets every year and, come back to the tournament. And here was a guy who I believe had an Ohio State connection in his past, had been a president like Mars Hill or some other school. I'm not sure if that was immediately before he came to Clemson. But, the guy, it's not like he was anti-athletics. But you just have to wonder. I don't know what the board of trustee to president dynamics were back then, if maybe more so from a social media standpoint, because there was enough interactive radio, call-in shows. Like there were some local news call-in shows back then. So obviously they became all Danny all the time for several weeks, plus the nightly statewide show. So there was enough interaction. Letters to the editor were a big deal back then, that the voices of the people were heard. But you just have to wonder if you'd had a board of trustees that was more in a position, felt like they didn't want to see this happen. That would have been a more interesting, I think, dynamic to explore back then compared to, subsequent years. But you raise a good point, but there was enough of a din. There was enough of a clamor about all this and enough influential people that, could have their voice heard without going on a talk show or writing a letter to the editor, could simply call a very powerful person. There were enough influential people that probably could have gotten this thing reversed, or at least probably tried to get this thing reversed, and I think we can see did not have the success. Again, another backstory I've always heard on this, and I'm not saying this is necessarily for the record, but I think it's safe to discuss in this forum. You probably heard the same thing. It was only a few years earlier, of course, that the whole SMU thing had happened. And you'll remember Clemson had its issues in the early 80s, and there was a concern, I've been told over the years, that Clemson felt like maybe they needed to make this change because they feared, what's to say the NCAA won't do to us what they did to SMU. Now, keep in mind, what no one knew at the time was that David Burst, who had run the whole investigation at SMU, had basically stated to the powers that be that, and maybe it had been decided among those at the NCAA who make such decisions, they would never do a death penalty to a program again, to that extent. I've simply heard that. Again, these are conversations you hear over the years. I'm not stating it for the record, but I'm told that there was maybe a thought that perhaps as a show to the NCAA that they had institutional control, that perhaps this was one of the motivating factors as to why things had to transpire the way they did, above and beyond some of the things that Danny had expressed about an athletic dorm, about some of the energy toward building what would be Vickery Hall, and anything else. And then there may be other aspects and issues between Danny and the administration and Danny at the time that I'm not privy to.
Yeah, and another sort of highlighting of how sort of the stars aligning with Dabo and sort of the genius behind the vision there is the alignment is so harmonious from Dabo up above him, Dan Radakovich, and then the president of the board of trustees, and compared to with Danny, he's constantly
great alignment,
bickering with everybody. And then I think Danny even told me himself years ago, I think the two sides were just kind of hot-headed and stubborn and emotional. And had we taken a deep breath, maybe a few deep breaths, and let some cooler heads prevail, then maybe it could have gotten resolved. But I think he even acknowledged that I was too bullish with bullheaded with what I was doing, and probably so was the other side as well. So,
well, and keep in mind too, it had been 5 years earlier that Clemson had issues between a president and an athletic director, and one could argue, even though both ended up moving on, that you could argue athletics, from what I'm told, again, I wasn't there for it, but perhaps this was the university saying, look, we feel like we've got to do this now. We can't keep making it look like athletics gets the win, if that makes any sense. And again, both the athletic director and the president, who were at loggerheads in the mid-'80s, subsequently moved on. And I've also had this shared with me over the years, and this is nothing against Bobby Robinson, because he did some great things against some really difficult circumstances during his time as the athletic director, and in a different time at Clemson might have been able to achieve so much more. But, it might have, maybe if there was, and again, Bobby Robinson had been in the AD job only for a few years when this all happened. But again, maybe an additional party that could have stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, let's just everyone go into a corner and take those breaths. But I think that additional voice of reason, and maybe that voice of reason could have come from a board of trustees. Maybe that voice of reason could have been a booster who might have been more in the know, and could have been that person who kind of, been a consensus builder, and let's just all get this figured out, and we can figure out a way to coexist. Everyone doesn't have to like each other, but perhaps. And again, maybe, and again, I don't know this, I wasn't in the room, but maybe Bobby Robinson did. I'll say this, I'm sure Bobby Robinson did everything he could toward that end. And it was just a fight that he, didn't have enough battleships and tanks to be able to make happen and keep the peace.
If ESPN ever decides to do a 30 for 30 on Clemson football, it'll probably be the Dabo era, but honestly, I would rather see a 30 for 30 on the Danny era.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and kind of to go back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, Dabo in 2008, I mean, my goodness, it was like, he was standing at the plate and 4 Nolan Ryans were, throwing their best fastball at him at the same time for all that happened for him from that day in October, really until the day he puts the green jacket onto the West end zone and he's, officially till December 1st, officially got the job. But I do vividly remember, and heck, these quotes may have been written by you, and I'm sure it was reporting your site, but I do remember among the things that he did during those months of being the interim head coach, I remember Danny Ford commenting about Dabo. Now, this might have been something simply that a reporter just reached out to Danny, but I vividly remember it, and I was like, wow, if Danny's saying that really says a lot about how Danny said, just watching Dabo do his thing, and just watching this team play, you can just tell that, he was basically saying the edges are really squared, and I like how the guys are running, their pads are in the right place, and that kind of thing. And that's always stuck in my mind. And that might have been the week going into the Clemson-Carolina game of that year in 2008. I always remember that because it wasn't, for some reason, within several months after that, I was pulling some old video of the late 80s. Maybe it was something to do with Terry Allen. Or just so I went back in our archives, but just watching some of that, that option running game. We always think of Clemson, well, they ran the option. But I'll tell you one thing. Once they gave that ball to Joe Henderson or Terry Allen, or you go back to Kenny Flowers and Terrence Flagg, that whole crowd, I mean, just the cuts and you just look at, and a lot of it I'm looking at is a downstairs camera, and oftentimes from the end zone with the offense running towards you. But you just see where all the edges were squared back in that Danny Ford offense and Chuck Reedy offense, and for all the criticism of it, just, the cuts were so nice and perfect, and the blocking, and there was always, that guard that pulled was always in the right place, or big Chris Lancaster was always right there to demolish a guy. So Wesley McFadden or Joe Henderson or Terry Allen or one of those guys, and again, the other guys before them. But I vividly remember Danny saying some really encouraging things, positive things about Dabo and what he'd seen. I'm pretty sure that was Clemson Carolina week of 2008. I don't know if it was the result of Danny coming out to a practice or not. You may know specifically, but I do remember seeing Danny say something. I thought, hey, it's a gracious thing for Danny to say. He didn't have to say that, but I don't think Danny would have said it to the extent that he did had he not really believed it. And I always thought that was a very positive thing as far as Dabo being able to get the job full time. I mean, one of many things, but I thought that was something nice to have on your reference list, so to speak.
Pete Yanity, this has been really cool to sort of dig back and take the trip down memory lane from somebody who watched a lot of it happen. Really appreciate you joining the podcast.
It has been my pleasure, and it's a really interesting era, man. It's a time when my life changed quite a bit during that whole time. Moved from Florence here to the upstate. Just a couple of real quick. Can I go out of time?
Sure,
I don't
absolutely.
I don't know if your sponsors will put it, but just this will. And again, Danny. Just kind of thinking about it, this will just kind of give you an idea as to what Danny Ford was all about. And I first met him in 1985. I told you about those Tuesdays in the fall when we'd come up from Florence, because back then, if you didn't do it, somebody might be able to get it to you a couple of days later, but you had to go get things yourself, really, if you wanted them on time. But even as a weekend guy in the fall of 85, our weekday guy decided just to have me come up on a Tuesday, which I thought was great. And, they let you interview Danny one-on-one. So that's the first time I got to know him. And he seemed very reserved. I'd only seen him on TV, but a very nice guy and could not have been more gracious. And I'm 21 years old at the time, and I'm, a couple of months out of college. And I just thought, hey, that's pretty neat. This guy's won a national title, and he, was pretty cool. Anyway, so time goes on, and as it is in my main job on a Friday night, I'm at a lot of different, in the fall, I'm out covering high school games, in and out, getting highlights. And then every so often you'll see, coaches from different schools. And over the years, I've gotten to know them. Back then, I would just recognize them in their orange, but they'd see me with a camera, I'd give away. I'm assuming Danny was at some of these games because, he was with an assistant to watch a kid. Because in the PD, they got Richard McCullough out of Loris, Norris Brown out of Conway. They got this kid named Ty Gibson out of Hartsville during that era, who's probably one of the most physically impressive kids I've ever seen. And they come over. They got some kids over there, but they were always over there. One time on just a generic July night, I run down to get a takeout order at some restaurant, and Miles Aldridge is sitting in the lobby waiting to get seated. I'm like, "Hey, Coach, you don't know me, but oh yeah, how you doing?" So that's the first time I ever met Miles Aldridge. Was like in the summer of '88 on Irby Street in Florence at some restaurant. But anyway, but this will just kind of give you an idea as to what Danny Ford's all about. So I'm at the Oklahoma Gator Bowl, January 2nd, 1989 for the 88 season, when Dexter Davis from Sumter, who I'd covered in high school, another kid we covered them. They really weren't in the PD. They're more Midlands, but we still covered their team. Anyway, I remember Dexter Davis knocks down the Holloway, Jamel Holloway pass to the end zone, and Clemson wins 13-6 or 13-7 on that last play. It was on a Monday in January, Monday the 2nd of January, 1989. Anyway, so we're in this media. They had a media tent. That's where you went, and they did the post-game coaches news conference. And there I am among the many media lined up with my little camera. I was just, again, your one-man banded things, and then you went out to a satellite truck and did a live shot. And I'm just shooting there, but Danny catches my eye, and he's just kind of going on his opening comments. But he catches my eye, makes eye contact with me, and he's like, we're just a program that, we just go get the best players and kids that want to fight and play hard. And then he looks up at me, kids like from Loris and Conway and places like that, whatever. And that's just the magic of Danny Ford. And again, Dabo is that and then some. In terms of, he's such a wonderful marketer and all that, but that was just kind of Danny Ford. He didn't have to do it, but he knew that a guy like me would appreciate that kind of a soundbite in recapping that game. And it's just stuff like that about Danny. But that's the kind of guy, Danny. He's just a good guy, and he's again such an incredibly smart person. With Dabo, you meet him, there's no doubt he's a bright guy. Danny, of course, kind of sold the old, 3 yards in a cloud of dust attitude, but he truly is a brilliant man. And just observing him over the years, and then the many conversations and just hearing him speak and all of that, the guy he's just a heck of a guy, really a good guy.
So how did y'all's relationship develop over the years after, of course?
Yeah. Well, so it helps. So those Tuesdays of making 6-hour trips, having anchored at 11 o'clock on a Monday night. And I did it from 87 to 89. And then in the fall of 90, I started having my weekend guy doing, because it's just like, I've been doing this for 3 years. And then I was in, the upstate by the end of October of 1990. But anyway, all those, this just gives you value of when you hustle in our business. And I don't have to tell you that, because you've, been able to achieve unbelievable things because of your hustle. But when you hustle in our business, so all those Tuesdays of making the 3-hour trip to Clemson, to literally be on the campus for maybe an hour and a half, do your interviews, go have the great lunch. And I'll tell you, it was a fabulous lunch they served us. It was buffet style. It always had a wonderful roasted chicken, and the coleslaw was to die for. But then sit around also. So not only have you just interviewed him and a couple of players, but sitting around there, listening to him talk to the newspaper guys. We usually had to politely excuse ourselves around 12:45 because I had to go back and anchor the 6 o'clock news and drop the guys off in Columbia. Then I'd walk in the station about 4 o'clock. But again, I had, a tape with all kinds of great sound about that week's Clemson game. But just this will give you a great example of when you hustle. So that's kind of how he got to know me. Now, I would go up there on Saturdays and cover games. I didn't cover every Clemson game between 87 and 89 because, again, I usually rotate between Clemson and South Carolina. Back then, Clemson, of course, played 1 o'clock games. There were many Saturdays that I'd go to Clemson, cover their 1 o'clock game, drive down to Columbia. We had a place where you could feed video out of in Columbia. I would feed my stuff out of there, and then I'd go cover USC's 7 o'clock game. I double dipped that run many times between 87 and 89. So he'd get to see me, and And when you interviewed the coach after the game back then, you kind of just gather around in almost like a tunnel behind their locker room in the old West End Zone setup. And I asked him questions. So we developed that professional relationship. But then, again, the power of hustle and getting to know a guy, because there weren't many from around the state who, as I recall, in the TV media, doing what I was doing, driving across state every doggone Tuesday to interview him for, 10 or 11 weeks, and then coming up to many of the games, talking to him after the game and that stuff. So he gets the whole Arkansas thing happens in 1992. Citadel goes out there, beats Arkansas. They fire Jack Crow, who had been on Danny Ford's last staff at Clemson, interestingly enough. Joe Kynes becomes the interim, but all of a sudden we get word that Danny Ford is, going to be come out there to, I don't know, but it eventually transpires he gets hired as head coach. Well, the fact that I could do, I'm able to do a one-on-one by satellite with the guy. And I'm not so sure that had he not known who I was, he would have done that with just someone from back in South Carolina for very obvious reasons. We're talking, we're 2 years removed from everything falling apart. I'm sure he still had hard feelings. Why wouldn't he? It's completely understandable. And I always thought that kind of helped from that standpoint. And that was a big part of it. People also don't realize this. So everything goes down in January at Clemson. May 30th or 31st of that year, he has Bob Bradley put together a media gathering at the old Greenville Auditorium in Greenville so that he could speak his piece, because this was just a couple of days after the NCAA came out with its, we're putting you on 5 years probation, but it's, it's not going to be as bad as the previous one. You can still go to bowls, still be on TV and all of that. He gets and that's the most emotional I've ever seen him. I'll never forget him saying, all I did was try to bring kids in to go to college, to get their education and to win. And he breaks up when he says, and to win. And so we do the thing at the Greenville Auditorium. That's in May of 1990. I come up here in October of 1990 for my job. And then in the winter of in January or February of 91, all of a sudden, Joe Williams, the former Furman basketball coach, it might have been a couple years later, they unveil that Greenville is going to be part of this new thing called the Global Basketball Association. And they're going to play with a white basketball. And he had this beautiful color chart of seating at the Greenville Auditorium, which at that point was probably the falsest advertising ever of this. The building was just in such godforsaken shape. But one of those who was going to be on the, executive board of the new Greenville Spinners of the Global Basketball Association was Danny Ford. And I'm like, geez. I'm thinking like at Gadsden High, maybe he played basketball, but really? And they were just doing anything they could to get attention to this thing. And, for those couple of years that he was just kind of hanging out on the farm in the upstate, every so often you hear, hey, Danny's going to put his name behind this. And, they honored Frank Howard at like some Greenville touchdown club thing. I'll never forget. And we had video, there's Danny helping Frank Howard, come into the old Holiday Inn there on Roper Mountain Road in Greenville. But it was funny. Danny just kind of kept popping up for the rest of he kind of came out with out of the shadows and out of hiding with the Greenville Spinners thing. Then he just kind of pop up at different events for the rest of 91 into 1992. And then he gets the Arkansas thing. Again, Joe Kynes was the interim coach. I'm pretty sure it was in the fall of 92 that Danny actually went out there to kind of become a consultant, with everyone realizing they're going to name him the head coach. And because I'm pretty sure Kynes finished that year out, and I'm sorry, I don't have a specific, but then they eventually named him the head coach. But I just think it probably helped, and it helped him be comfortable with that satellite interview, because I'm sitting in my studio in Spartanburg. He's sitting out there in Fayetteville. But there was a certain comfort, a certain chemistry, a certain rapport. And then obviously he goes through the Arkansas deal, eventually moves back here. And then whenever we see each other, it's, it's just, I appreciate the fact I've always looked at him as this iconic figure. And I think he appreciates that I'm one of those, familiar faces from back in the late 80s when times were, pretty doggone good for him.
Is it common for TV stations to still have the archived footage of all the press conferences and such that happened back in the 80s? Not
the actual press conferences, but basically the way it goes is, like, whatever we show on the air, we then save in an archive system. Now, sadly, you go back to the 80s, and we've got stuff all the way back to the late 70s, okay? But from 1977 to 1989, into the 89 year, we can't play any of it because it's on a format of tape that the last machine we had that played it broke. And apparently, they don't make replacement parts. Our engineers don't want to fix it. So I've got, 13 or 14 years of unbelievable archive stuff that I can't even, if we really had to have it, we could probably find a company that could do it. There'd be a cost involved. But yeah, for the most part, from the beta tape era, which we can still play, I can go back and find anything that we need. And obviously I've been here at my station since 1990. And so, something ever happens historically, I'm thinking, boom, I remember doing the interview with this guy, or I remember getting video of this guy then. And if you look in, May of 1990 or May of 1992 or whatever, we interviewed him here. And there's also video with that or that kind of thing. So yeah. Oh yeah. And obviously since the middle of the last decade, or actually since about 2012, now everything of course sits on a cloud somewhere, which makes it even easier to find if it was properly put in there. But that's way too technical stuff that you need to know. But yeah, and then from a high school football standpoint, I mean, again, some guy makes the Hall of Fame somewhere that played here in 1991, 92, boom, I can have it in my machine and on the air within 2 minutes.
I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I'd be really entertained to be able to go back and watch
you'd have
hours
a field day. You'd have a field day. Because again, and a lot of it is, and again, we not only, so I misspoke. So like the high school stuff we show on the air, we save. But like the Clemson stuff and the South Carolina stuff, if we shoot it, we'll save 15 minutes of it. And my station, we got the contract to produce the Clemson shows again in 2017. Now, ever since things ended with me in April of 2014, I've had my number 2 guy, who's an amazing guy and does great stuff, pretty much cover Clemson. So, and he'll shoot a lot of it. And so, but ever since we've started doing the coaches shows, now he's always there shooting on the sideline every game. And then we use the TV video for the upstairs video. But, we probably have 15 to 20 minutes of every Clemson game. And, we've got every player, several plays of every player that we save in the archive. But so the point being, you go all the way through our archive system of what can be played since 1989. And you not only have different plays, but there's also a lot of natural sound stuff on the sidelines, guys saying things, Reggie Herring chewing out Alex Ardley on the sideline of the game up at Duke or North Carolina, which is, classic in 2000, I think. You know what I'm saying? So, oh yeah, I mean, we've got all kinds. It's amazing. And sometimes when I go back and I'll search for something, I'll be shuttling through and I'll see it's like, God, I forget that, just something completely unrelated. And, I'll forget that or whatever.
Really cool stuff, Pete. This has been fun. I'm sure you got work to do today. I don't want to hold you for
all
too long. All
good, man. Anytime for you and then this podcast and the great work you do with it.
The feeling is mutual about you and your work, Pete. I appreciate your friendship, and it's great to catch up.
All right, my friend. Good talking to you. I'm sure maybe sometime down the line when the 10 people you have booked can't make it, I'll be there for you. I know.
That sounds good. All right. Thanks to Pete Yanity and Cubelic for their participation in this week's podcast. Also appreciate the loyal support of our 6 sponsors. Most of all, thanks to all of you for your interest in listening every week. Really appreciate it. Everybody be safe. Back next week. Cheers.